Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning to panels and audience. Welcome to 4th Kuala Lumpur International Multidisciplinary Academic Conference year 2022. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Siti Massuriani binti Muhamad Amin from National University of Malaysia. Today, I would like to present and share with all of you about my study titled Relationship between FDI Employment and Government Expenditure on Malaysia Economic Growth and Empirical Study on 2012 until 2020. My presentation will be covered introduction, background of study, model, data and methodology, data findings, policy implication, and conclusion. Continuous and sustained economic growth is still an unfulfilled aspiration for a few countries in the world due to prolonged and wide-ranging policy uncertainties. According to the United Nations 2020, to ensure and sustainable economic growth and meet the ambitious target of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, a vibrant and inclusive global economy is essential through the formulation and execution of a wide range of policy initiatives. Meanwhile, according to OECD 2019, the Southeast Asia has become one of the sustained economic growth has become possible. In this regard, all economies requires policy facilitating reduction of trade dispute, proper utilization of energy, articulation of suitable human capital formation, and appropriate foreign direct investment. After this code as FDI, therefore, the determination of factors responsible for economic growth is still a focal point of research for many researchers and policymakers across the globe. Graph 1 shows the comparison of the economic growth in Asian countries. It shows that all facing decline GDP in the second quarter of 2020. The decline is because of the impact of the pandemic COVID-19, which is spreading throughout the world. Meanwhile, Graph 2 shows the Malaysia economic growth rate in monthly, quarterly, and annually. Economic growth is influenced by various factors, whether internal or external, especially in this era where the economy is particularly vulnerable to the external influence through economic, political, and social factors. Therefore, it is important for a country to know the main factors that contributing or influencing to the country economic growth. Hence, appropriate measures can be taken to achieve sustainable growth or to reduce negative influences from both internal and external. Based upon a survey of the literature, many studies have investigated the effect of FDI on economic growth in the context of the FDI-led growth hypothesis. Generally, some studies found that inflows of FDI have positive implications on economic growth through spillover effect on technology, managerial skill, business, and employment opportunities. However, there are studies that found no favorable impact of FDI on the economic growth and development of host countries. The relationship between economic growth and employment is also one of the debated issues in national strategies. Emphasis has to be on productive and remunerative employment. In the other words, economic growth should result from a suitable combination of employment growth and productivity growth. Another study finds that GDP growth, using the example of Slovakia, does not necessarily imply an increase in the employment rate. Results show that remittance and economic growth have a significant positive effect on employment. Actually, there are two mainly opposing views on the relationship between economic growth and government expenditure. In this area, the Keynesian's view implies that higher government spending will cause higher economic growth. On the other hand, Wagner hypothesis states that the development of an industrial economy will be accompanied by an increased share of public expenditure in gross national product. So, from the previous research that finds debated views among the relationship between GDP with FDI, employment, and government expenditure in a separate study. Hence, we opine that further research need to be done to examine the relationship of FDI, employment, and government expenditure on Malaysia economic growth in one study. So, the hypothesis for this study, uh, which is H0 FDI employment and government expenditure have relationship on Malaysia economic growth, and H1 FDI employment and government expenditure does not have relationship on Malaysia economic growth. The objective of this study is to examine the relationship between FDI employment and government expenditure on Malaysia growth. It is this study also to determine the relationship between the selected variables. The importance of this study also is to give an overview to policymaker, academician, or relevant parties in formulating policy and guideline to stimulate economic growth in Malaysia. This study also can be used as reference, a reading material to the researcher that analyze or strengthen the same scope of study. Okay, actually there is a numbers of literature review that we have found. However, we just throw a few for the purpose for this presentation. For FDI, according to Omran and Bolbol, 2003, show that both high correlation and significant causation between FDI and economic growth for Arab countries through a causality test and OLS regression respectively. In the other hand, according to Charkovic and Levine 2005, conducted a panel study of 72 countries and found that FDI inflows do not have a positive impact on economic growth. For employment, according to Kojarun Prasid 2012, uh, the author found that a strong positive effect of FDI on Korea's economic growth, while human capital, export, and employment also positively affected subsequent growth. While for government expenditure, Wagner, 1883, quoted by Verma and Aurora, had given three main reasons for positive relationship between government expenditure and economic growth. While Nuruddin and Osman 2010 found that government expenditure have negative effect on economic growth in Nigeria. All the data used in this study is from Department of Statistics Malaysia or DOSM in Ringgit Malaysia value. Sample of the study is include quarterly data from 2012 until 2020. The researcher used three-step of test to examine the relationship between FDI, employment, and government expenditure, which is a stationary test, autoregressive distributed lag model, ARDL, and diagnostic tests. Okay, this is the model specification for this study, which is the researcher use a GDP as a dependent variable, while FDI, employment, and government expenditure as independent variable. We move to the methodology and data findings. This is the first step in this study, which is stationary test or unit root test. This test is used to test the level of stationary of each variable in the study. Each variable in the study needs to be stationary at level or at first difference. This condition needs to be fulfilled in order to estimate a value to be used. Okay, in this test, if we see in the table 1, ADF test, FDI and variable government expenditure stationary at level, and variable employment stationary at 1 at first difference. Meanwhile, variable GDP is still not stationary at both level. Hence, a unit root test adopt PP or Phillips parent method used for variable GDP. So based on PP test, GDP stationary at first difference. So based on the stationary test result for all variable, the most suitable method for further test is autoregressive distributed lag model, ARDL, which all the variables stationary at level and first difference and based on sample size. We move to next step. Okay, step 2 is ARDL step bound test. This is our function, regression function, which is a GDP is a function of FDI, employment, and government expenditure. Okay, based on the table 2, ARDL bound test estimate. Okay, F statistic 4.24 is larger than F stat at the first at significant level of 99%. ARDL bound test is a benchmark to identify the existence of long relationship among the variable selected. From the result in the table 2, which is F stat larger than critical values 3.65. We can conclude that the result as a principle we uh, reject HO and accept H1, which is there are long-term relationship among the variables. Okay, then we move to next step, ARDL long run result. From the table, variables employment show positive and significant value at the level of 99 significance. 1% increase in employment will lead to 7 to 9.27% in GDP. The value of R square of 0.9724 is indicate of 97.24% variation of GDP explained by variables in the study, which is variable FDI, employment, and government expenditure. Next, table 4, ARDL short run result. Okay, the table is to test the error correction term test. The value of ECT is need to be observed and evaluated, and the range of the value is -2, between -2 and 0. So if we see in the table, the ECT value is -0.8879, which is in the range of -2 and 0. The ECT value, the ECT values is also reflects the speed of adjustment, which is if the economic shock happens and it costs stay from equilibrium point, then a mechanism will bring back to the level equilibrium with the speed of adjustment negative 0.8879. Then we move to the step 3, which is a diagnostic test. Okay, first normality test result. If we see in the graph, the probability is bigger than 0.05 as principle, so that we can conclude that we fail to reject null hypothesis, and we conclude that the data is normal. Then next test, a serial correlation test result. Also, if we see in the EViews result, the probability figure is also bigger than 0.05, and we can conclude that we fail to reject null hypothesis, and we can conclude that no serial correlation problem. Then through heteroscedasticity test result, we also found that the probability is bigger than 0.05 as principle, and fail to reject null hypothesis. And then we can conclude that the variables are homos and free from heteroscedasticity problem. And then from the heteroscedasticity test, arch test, based on the value is also larger than 0.05, and then we can conclude that we fail to reject null hypothesis. Okay, this is for heteroscedasticity test arch. The probability test also is larger than 0.05, and as a principle we fail to reject null hypothesis, and concluded as no arch problem. And the fifth test is stability test, which is include Kusum test and Kusum square test. Okay, graph 4 is a Kusum test. If we can see, the blue lines should be between upper bound and lower bound, and the blue line indicates the stability of the data. According to the Kusum test, we can say the data is stable since the blue lines is within the upper and lower bound. However, for Kusum square test, the blue line is exceed the lower bound. So we can conclude that the data is unstable. So this is the summary of the diagnostic test. As I mentioned before. Okay. For data findings indicate that variable that has been selected in this study, which is GDP, FDI, employment and government expenditure, are stationary. Hence, the study continues using the data, And based on ARDL methodology, only variable employment has a positive relationship on GDP. Besides that, the variable that used in the study indicate that normal data, free from serial correlation problem, free from heteroscedasticity problem, and free from arch problem. However, the data used in this study is slightly unstable proven by Kusum square test. In the other hand, variable FDI and government expenditure were not significant due to multicollinearity problem that has been detected in this study. Based on the findings, related parties involved in formulating policies regarding economic growth may consider that policies related to employment should be taken into consideration accordingly in driving and stimulating economic growth. Industry players, academia, and federal government may consider this study as one of the references for them in formulating certain policies. The findings of this study, which highlighted the relationship and impact of the variables selected to the economic growth, can be used as a basis for further research. In addition, the multicollinearity problem and unstable data inherent in this study need to be addressed in producing more significant study and to be more useful to the related parties. So I think this is all about my study that I can share with audience. I hope it can useful to related parties. So thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye.